Welcome, yield nerds. I have a very interesting and off the beat topic today. It is the topic of emergency rate cuts and what you need to do to prepare for one if it ever happens. So, the subject is how can you prepare for an emergency rate cut? And we're going to assume it could happen in 2023 and see what you need to do if indeed that is going to happen. My usual disclaimers, this is not investment advice, it is education. You make the decisions. I'm not a financial advisor. I do not have product to sell. I couldn't care less whether you buy anything or not. And I do not have sponsorships. All right. So first thing is the agenda. We're going to talk about what is an emergency rate cut. We're going to historically see when emergency rate cuts happened and what kind of led up to it happening. And then we're going to study on a time series basis what happened to the market, to the various asset classes a month after an emergency rate cut, 6 months later, 12 months later. And if you learn from the past, you can then decipher what you should do before an emergency rate cut and kind of figure out a strategy. That is the goal. Welcome to Yield Nerd, an educational show about how you can acquire and manage yield. Well, new visitors, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. I want to make sure you know that this show is organized as a playlist, and the playlist has a sequential order of things that you may want to watch. It picks up from somebody who can just speak English, understand English, doesn't know anything about the financial markets, and walks them up to topics like today. So I hope you pick up the playlist, and I welcome any and all comments. All right, let's talk about what the FOMC calendar is. This is the Federal Open Market Committee. It's a bunch of people who discuss and set the federal funds rate, as it is called, and they meet several times a year. To be precise, they meet somewhere around 8 times a year. And if you say there are 12 months in a year, they meet 8 times, give or take every month and a half is when they meet. And the Federal Reserve Chairman speaks at the end of that as a summary of what their recommendations are. And that is the rate setting meeting, and that is what moves the market a lot. So that kind of is the normal calendar, if you will, the anticipated calendar. And the dates shown here are for 2023. And those of you listening to this right as it comes out towards the third week of January, in another week is the next FOMC meeting. Well, then the question is, what is an emergency rate cut? You saw those 8 meetings a year. Generally, increases or decreases to the federal funds rate are announced during or at the conclusion of those meetings. If there is a decrease in the federal funds rate outside the normal cycle of meetings, then it is called an emergency rate cut. That begs the question, why would the Fed want to say, we can't even wait for another month and a half, we're going to rush and announce a rate cut? Therein lies the question of when did it happen before and what triggered it happening before. So let's look at that. The moral you may remember is that before there is an emergency rate cut, there's got to be an OMG moment. An OMG moment where there was a plan A, things were going well, not going well. There is a sudden realization, not only is the plan not working, we need to act now. And that is the emergency rate cut. So think about the nation's history. Think about when there were such moments. And let's look at the last 2 decades and see what those moments are. The dot-com crash. Right as we entered 2001, we already had a mild recession, and the Fed tried to get the economy going by saying, hey, we're going to cut the rate. We need businesses to accelerate. That didn't work. A month later, one more emergency cut, and then 9/11 was a big change to an already declining economy, and there was a pronounced decrease in economic activity. The nation bounces out of that, and there were no other emergency cuts all the way until the 2008 crash, the financial crisis. Pardon me. So in 2007, there was the next rate cut, And as we all know, that was a really big and severe financial crash, different than the geopolitical crash which happened in 2001. And so, after the financial crash, there was yet another rate cut to try and stimulate the economy. It took several years, but the economy did come back. Guess what? After 2008, there were no emergency cuts for a very long time. And there were cuts. There was a lot of stimulation of the economy. The economy did fantastically. There was almost a 12, 14-year bull market all the way until 2020. And March 2020, you know and I know, COVID changed the way the world worked. And there was a cut on March 3rd. Because of the magnitude of the effect of COVID on the economy, there was another emergency cut 2 weeks later. So when we talk about an emergency rate cut in 2023, we really don't want that. So what could precipitate it? Suppose there is talk of this, we're going to have a soft landing. Well, we really didn't mean a soft landing. We're going to have a softish landing, and these are words used by Chairman Powell. Let's say that we're not able to have a softish landing and there is a hard landing. There is a big drop in the market. Businesses get crushed. If something like that happens, there may be an emergency rate cut in 2023. That begs the question, what does history tell us about what happens to the market after an emergency rate cut? That is what we're going to see in detail now. I'm going to give a citation here. I'm going to draw from this article, which is a fantastic article. The title of the article is 2008 versus 2020. What happens when the funds rate is 0%? The article was written in July 2021, a very prescient article, which says, hey, here's how we would position if 2020 were kind of sort of going to act like 2008. Here is what you may want to think about. And it is so well written, I would encourage you to find the original. And if you don't have the time to read the original, here is a Reader's Digest version. A month after an emergency cut, the top half here are the various equity asset classes. The bottom half here are the various fixed income asset classes. You don't have to be a scientist to say the top half is more red than green. The bottom half is more green than red. In other words, when there is an emergency rate cut, bonds that pay a higher interest are considered more attractive, so those go up in their value. And so that's a very interesting thing to know, that a month later, the shock value of, oh my goodness, the Fed is going to start dropping their federal funds rate. Let me hang on tight to the bonds. And those in the equity market say, if the Fed thinks there is a recession, then, oh my goodness, this is really bad. So I'm going to dump all my stocks. And that's why equity values are crashing all over the place. And they go into bonds. That's 1 month after an emergency rate cut. 6 months later, if you see here, even between the 1 month and the 6 month, there is even more red in the top half. So when there is a recession, it lasts definitely 6 months. It is worse 6 months later than the first emergency rate cut. The bond market, however, is feeling even better. So the bond market is better 6 months after the emergency rate cut than it was on the date of the rate cut. Check this out. 12 months later, we pretty much have a solid green in the bond market and a huge swath of red in the equity market. And here is what this says. If you were to look at S&P, notice 0% is here. What this is telling you is 1 month later, 6 months later, 12 months later, largely the S&P doesn't even come back to what it was before the emergency rate cut. So if there is an emergency rate cut, there will be a flight from equity to treasury bonds. That's the S&P. Let's look at growth stocks. They get absolutely slaughtered. They go down to almost 45% below where they were before the emergency rate cut, because generally they have a lot of debt and generally they are very risky. And if you run away from risk, you're going to run into safe havens and you're going to dump growth stock. So a month, 6 months, 12 months later, everybody runs away. The COVID recession, as it is called, was an unusually short recession because it was artificially manufactured. The government shut down the economy. It wasn't a true recession in that scenario, it was a manufactured recession. So when it comes to COVID, you're actually going to see that growth stocks came back from the dead within a year. However, it's not producing stellar returns. It's producing 4 or 5% returns a year after an emergency rate cut. How about value stocks? Value stocks, as you may remember, are those that you cannot live without. These are big corporations, and I'm not going to mention names, but you can Google who are the big value stocks. They do tend to have debt, and anything with a debt in a financial crisis is going to get crushed. And over a period of time, because they are value, because they are defensive, they tend to come back. And the recession itself definitely lasts more than a year after the rate cut. What about treasuries? It's a party in treasury land. This is zero. So there is only upside in treasuries. A month later, we're at 2%. 6 months later, 7%. A year later, 14% to 12%. So if there is an emergency rate cut, enjoy, buy even more treasuries. At least this is what the history says. The good times roll in treasuries when there is an emergency rate cut. 2022, however, was an anomaly. Why was it an anomaly? Bonds and stocks crashed, and unemployment was low, inflation was high, and interest rates are increasing. I mean, in the normal terms, you would imagine, interest rates would be low when unemployment is low. In this scenario, they both are kind of in opposite ends. It's high interest rates, low unemployment. There is inflation, which is not coming down quickly, and bonds are not acting like a safe haven. But if you were to, instead of scratching your head on what is happening with this, if you were to Google some of the newer articles, stocks and bonds, the correlation is reversing. Read that article. There is a lot of indications now that as the stock market is depressing, the bond market indeed is going up. You do your own homework, but there is a lot of things happening in 2023 which make it an anomaly. Therefore, what is historical advice on what to do if you think there wouldn't be a softish landing, if you think in the middle of the year there could be a jarring surprise? Please watch this video in the whole notion that there indeed could be a catastrophe in the middle of the year. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't happen. That is something for you to keep in mind. A rate cut in 2023, 2024 is inevitable. With the way rates have been going up, up, and up, at some point there will be a flat line and a rate cut. And if unfortunately there is a nightmare scenario and there is a default, everybody is expecting a rate cut, rates would actually go up because credit rating comes down. Barring the nightmare, eventually there will be a rate cut. And if you don't want to face the nightmare, if you want to be defensive, watch the previous episode and you will see what we think about the nightmare scenario. But barring that, when there is an emergency rate cut, your higher paying treasuries will jump in value, is what history says. Using the analogy we've introduced in this show for quite a while, eat more ice cream, load up on less than 6-month treasuries, cut duration, sit and wait until the middle of the year. If there is no nightmare scenario, then I would increase duration, because at some point there will be a rate cut and your bonds are likely to soar in value. That is what history says. You make your own decision. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, here is my email. I welcome your thoughts and I'm happy to contribute. Thank you for listening to Yield Nerd, a do-it-yourself show for yield accumulation and management.